So thank you for making the time to have this discussion with me. I mean,
It's a
what I
delight.
wanted to,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you. So, I mean, what I wanted to talk about today was this issue of effective communication, you know. And I just want to give some context to this issue and what's typically said about effective communication.
Mm,
So effective communication is often defined some in line in kind of something along the lines of the process of exchanging ideas, thoughts, opinions, knowledge, and data so
mm,
that the message is received and understood with clarity and purpose. So
mm,
when we communicate effectively, both the sender and the receiver feel satisfied, you know? And then you know there'll be discussion also around the significance of effective communication and then data cited, like uh effective communication can uh produce billions of dollars worth of improvements in businesses, and that sort of stuff, to kind of give the economics behind getting effective communication right in organizations. Um,
mm,
and then they'll also go into what makes effective communication. So this people will say things like, for communication to be effective, it must be clear, correct, complete, concise, and compassionate, as an example. So this is what they call the 5 C's of
mm,
communication.
mm,
um yeah, so there's this whole discussion around effective communication. And I mean, my experience when I've engaged with clients, on their whole culture journey, some of them really frame this whole kind of this whole journey to improve their culture as really being a journey about how they communicate. So, but I'm also, I at the same time that I paid attention to the debate on effective communication, I experienced that there's also a level, in this debate that people aren't actually considering when it comes to effective communication. So, and that's actually why I wanted to talk to you about it, because I feel you'll have some very valuable insights on, uh, yeah, what sits behind effective communication, and and what do we need to consider beyond just how effectively I communicate, when I'm trying to wrap my head around the relationships I build with people and the kind of culture I cultivate.
mm. So I think pragmatically, all of the variables that you just sort of put forward with regard to what accounts for effective communication. I mean, this is almost of the level of motherhood and apple pie. I don't think one could challenge it. It's kind of they're intuitively true. Um, uh, However, there isn't a deeper issue regarding communication that almost challenges the the framing of the difference between good and bad communication as effective or ineffective, because that creates a very sort of transactional and a sort of a conditional motive to communication.
Mm.
You know, if I communicate well, I get things done. Well, is the purpose of communicating getting things done? This is not dissimilar from the problem that we've indicated before with the overall agenda of leadership in modern organizations, which is about achieving a result through people. That sort of what is good is what gets things done. Um, do you, I mean, if, you could have a mafia organization that communicates very well and gets horrendous things done. So we really do need to interrogate the issue of a communication at the level of intent. Um, and in in doing that, I think one needs to consider an unconditional sort of possibility of framing the issue of communication. There is, so, I mean, our view is that an organization actually is a pattern of interactions between individuals. That's what the organization is on the ground, as opposed to the organogram that sits in people's minds. And each one of those interactions is obviously a connection between one or two people, I mean, a number of people. And so I think fundamentally that connection can have one of two sort of products over a period of time. It can have either a solvent or an adhesive quality. I mean, it's either pulls people together or it can kind of just dissolve the bonds between people. And that's what I mean by solvent effect. What pulls people together is the intent of each person who's in the interaction to do what is best for the other. It is like the metaphor that we have of a good sports team. I mean, in a professional soccer game, most of the work that happens on the field is about a player trying to set somebody else up to succeed. It's not about the player trying to be the star. By definition, if everybody's trying to be the star, then you don't have a team. So that's when the member of the team acts with the intent to set their colleague up to succeed. That has a binding effect. That has an adhesive effect between members of the team. And the degree to which that happens, actually, amazingly, is the degree to which that team then becomes effective. But the purpose of the communication isn't the effectiveness. The purpose of the communication is to bind. Or it can have the opposite effect. It can repel. Now, there are two elements that are involved in the intent of somebody who connects with somebody else or communicates with somebody else with the intent to make the other person the star, with the intent to set the other person up to succeed. The first is a fundamental orientation towards other. In other words, when I communicate with you, I communicate with you in your best interest. And that means I communicate with you with the intention that you are the significant one in the communication. You see, very often the issue of communication is really concerned, well, they have to pay it. Good communication is when I get them to pay attention to my message. Then I'm communicating well. In other words, good communication is about affirming that I'm the significant one in this interaction. Actually, good communication isn't predicated on how articulate you are and how well you frame a message. Good communication starts off not with the giving side of that interaction, with the receiving side of the interaction, which is really about listening. So in the first instance, if I'm interacting in the best interest of the other, I am there in that interaction. It is clear in my mind that of the two, the significant one is not me, it is the other. And insofar as the other person is the significant one, I'm willing to suspend my agenda for the agenda of the other. So the first attribute of genuinely being there for the other is the self's ability to listen. So in the whole problem of communication, the problem of communication isn't in the first instance a problem of how articulate you are with regard to framing content. The problem of communication really is concerned with how well do you listen. Now, there's also a number of attributes and implications to that. If I listen well, if I suspend my agenda for the agenda of the other, it actually puts me in the position to understand whether what I'm about to say, whether my content is relevant or not, is appropriate or not, is helpful or not. It's a little bit like, wanting to build a building somewhere and you've not scouted the ground. Are you trying to build on a bog, or you're trying to build on somewhere you can't put down a foundation? Or you have to understand the ground. You have to know the person in the interaction, not generally. In the interaction, you've got to understand the ground. So you have to suspend what you want to say to understand where the person is at. The second rule to content is that when you now speak, the point is not so much to be articulate. Well, that doesn't give you a license to be sort of clumsy, but the point is to speak the truth. So there is an overall, if I'm interacting with you in order to make you the star, then one of the things I have to understand that sometimes for you to be the star, you may need to hear things that aren't pleasant for you to hear. So I need to communicate with you that which is going to be helpful to you, set you up to succeed. And that is predicated on the fact that I speak the truth. I mean, we have this rule that says, that the overall rule that governs speaking. So if we say communication has these two ends, listening and speaking, the overall rule that governs speaking is honesty. And honesty means that you speak the truth even if it is not in your interest to do so. But there's a caveat to this, and that's the last thing I want to say about this. Remember that the reason why I'm speaking the truth is because in speaking the truth, I'm trying to set you up, the other up to be the star. In other words, I'm not the significant one here, which means that my speaking the truth isn't about getting one over you. It doesn't give me license to be rude and demeaning and dismissive or sarcastic. So honesty has a rule, and the rule is it is kindness. The difference between the surgeon's knife and the thug's knife is that the surgeon's knife, while it creates a wound in the interest of the patient. Not in the interest of the person who's wielding the knife. And so it has to be with honesty. Your honesty can never be an excuse for discourtesy. So if I were to summarize this whole sort of bag of words up, talk about communication. The first rule is that the communication can either be a solvent or an adhesive. It's a solvent when the person acts in their own interest, when the speaker acts in their own interest. It's an adhesive when it's in the interest of the other. When you're speaking in the interest of the other, that it has to commence with the capacity not to say anything but to listen. Secondly, when you speak the truth with the intention to set the other up to succeed. So you're honest. However, that honesty doesn't give you an excuse to be rude. I think that would be my take on the issue of communication. And that wouldn't negate any of the things that these people have said that you've quoted. I think all of those things would find a place in this view. But I think what we're trying to articulate is almost like the intentional roots of the problem.
I mean, I do think, though, that what we're saying here undermines what, I suppose maybe the paradigm that people are using within which to kind of make sense of this communication thing, and also within which they place its significance. Because, if you say that actually good communication isn't about ticking technical boxes that are concerned with like clarity, or you can tick all those technical boxes and still fail at good communication, because actually good communication is just an expression of a sincere intent, actually. And so you don't even have to, this issue of how well I communicate is a secondary issue, and vastly paling in significance in the sight of this issue of what's my intent towards this person with whom I'm communicating. And I mean, and I suppose, particularly if you think about it as a, you know, as a relationship, we're communicating with people, and it's in the context of a relationship, and it's a relationship that patterns over time, right? And really, the question in the relationship that patterns over time is really not how eloquent is this person? That's really not. The question is, can I trust this person? Does this person act in my interest or not? And so your eloquence, your clarity of speech, those are virtues, and I suppose it enables certain things, and and one can work on them. But really, it's not the heart of the problem.
That's absolutely spot on. I completely concur, and I don't think that until this kind of this ethical dimension of the problem of communication is properly explored, that we would end up with anything other than propaganda and cosmetic stuff. We'll send people on, under the aegis of communication. Well, how do you do a proper PowerPoint? I mean, how do you do this? How do you do, it's not a how do. The problem of communication is not a how-to problem. It's a why problem.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, in organizational contexts, a lot of the there's a cynicism to a lot of the communication that comes from the organization to the employee, even though that communication is exquisite. I mean, it's, and that's particularly internally, like in very often there'll just be there'll be this distrust of every message that comes, even though it's exceptionally well articulated. It looks amazing, and that's because there's actually this skepticism about the intent of the people who are communicating, as you say.
That's right. We did some research in the 80s at the Chamber of Mines, which will take a little bit of time to recount. And would it be appropriate in this forum? Because I think it really touches on the heart of the problem. Yeah, shall I tell you the story?
Tell me the story.
We actually, interestingly enough, when I started working at the Chamber of Mines, one of the sort of pieces of work that our lab was involved was the whole issue of communication. In fact, my boss at the time, his name was Volker Heuberg, he was appointed as a communications expert. And he did some research on effective communication on mines. And he came up with a couple of really surprising findings. So bear in mind that now you're talking about the early 80s, and television was still a very new phenomenon in South Africa. I mean, we only got television in the mid-70s. So a lot of mines, particularly the more successful mines or the bigger mines, invested a lot of money in video and video studios in order to enhance management communications. And when Volker did an audit of media that were being used by employees, particularly by sort of laboring employees on the mines, he discovered amazingly that one of the most powerful media that people were using was not the video. It was actually a written brief sort of put out by management. These briefs were always done in English, and most people didn't understand English. I mean, you're talking about a semi-literate workforce. But that thing was far more effective and was appreciated far more as a communication medium. In fact, we found that employees who saw management on a management video trusted management less than employees who hadn't seen management on the video. The video actually had an inverse effect in terms of people's sort of commitment to the mine and trust in the leadership of the mine. So this was very confusing. And Volker, so how on earth do you account for this? Why do they accept the management brief and they don't accept the video? And his rationale for accounting for this was saying, I mean, the purpose of communication is content. I mean, he quoted this quote from Hamlet, where Hamlet sees the ghost of his father. He says, "It speaks, yet says nothing." I mean, when it speaks, it should say something. And the problem with this issue of content is that it is kind of like it has a moral tinge to it, because content is only useful if it's true. Now, a brief, even if you don't understand what is being said, you can get somebody else to read it for you and interpret it for you, but it's black and white. It attests to itself. Whereas if it's on video, you see it now and it's gone. You can't hold it up to verify it. So you can't test the content. And so we were kind of, well, Volker at the time, I shouldn't take accountability for this because it was his work. But he wrote a very convincing paper that went out to the industry saying, you guys are barking up the wrong tree. You must leave electronic media. The purpose of communication is content. Content is about truthfulness. Speak the truth and put it in writing. That was our dictum that went out to the mining industry. And you're talking 1985 when this happened. 2 years later, in the 1987 wage review strike, we did a climate survey on Vaal Reefs, one of the mines in the industry, immediately after the 1987. In fact, it was over the 1987 strike. We were there just before the strike and immediately after the September 87 strike. And it was a major strike. It was the biggest single wage strike that the country had ever seen. There's 500,000 men were out on strike. The entire industry was out on strike. When we went and had a look at on one of the shafts, when we had a look at effective communications or effective media, we found that by far the most effective medium on this particular shaft, 5 shaft, was the public address system in the hostel. Now, just consider this for a moment. The public address system suffers from the same problems as the video because it's transient, it's electronic. Secondly, technically it's bad. I mean, these public address systems, they buzz, they crackle, they're not clear, particularly in those years. So why is it that here was a medium that was breaking all the rules that we had articulated? It's nothing to do with text, nothing about it's verifiable. It's not even a good medium. So I searched through the data set to try and understand why. And actually, the reasons for this became apparent when I looked at the open-ended material that employees gave us. There's one employee said, management used the public address system. We asked him, are management communications on the shaft effective or not? And he said that they were effective. And when we asked him why, he said, management used the public address system when they want to say something. And the quote was, during the time of the strike, a certain Mr. Botha was using the public address system begging us to go back to work. And I thought, well, that's interesting. How come this man could nominate this man, this Mr. Botha? His name is Johan Botha. Now, I need to tell you a bit of a story about this Johan Botha. Johan Botha got the shaft to manage 18 months prior to the 1987 wage review strike. At the time of a terrible series of events on the shaft, there'd been a union-organized execution of 4 team leaders, so that's the lowest level supervision in the hostel. I mean, basically, the union reps dragged these 4 team leaders into the arena, the sports arena of the hostel. The whole workforce was sitting there. They put these guys up on tables and they stabbed them to death with broken chopsticks, which is one hell of a way to go. It's like breaking a broomstick and ramming it through a person. It just so happened that all 4 of these men that were executed in this horrendous way were Sothos from Lesotho. And the whole branch committee at the time were Xhosas from the Eastern Cape. So literally within a day, there was a massive mobilization of Sotho employees against Xhosa employees, because these Sothos were saying these guys are killing us. The war that erupted was absolutely incontainable. Management would bring in Goldfield security, they'd lock down the hostel, they'd fleece the place for weapons. They literally got truckloads of weapons out of the place. Within literally hours of Goldfield security leaving the hostel, there was gunfire in the hostel. I mean, it was, it was wild. It was just at the time of this massive fight that this Johan Botha was given the shaft to manage. He was promoted to being the next production manager in charge of the shaft. He dealt with this problem by going into this hostel at war. No bulletproof vest, no sidearm, no security. He went alone. The only thing he took with him was a megaphone. He walked into the center of the fray where people were literally trying to kill each other. I mean, into where people are busy with hand-to-hand combat. He would stand in between people who were fighting and scream at them over the megaphone. What are you doing? We're not here to kill each other. We're here to mine gold. Stop this. No. And it took him a couple of days, consistently putting his own life on the line. Eventually, people said, this guy's crazy. They started, the fight stopped. People went to work and they kind of normal production continued. So fast forward now 18 months after that event. On the first day of the 1987 wage review strike, 5 shafts struck with the rest of the gold mining industry. On the second day, this Johan Botha, walks into the hostel, picks up the public address system in the hostel and says over this public address system, listen, guys, it's like a megaphone, public address system. I don't know why we're fighting, but we're not here to fight. I don't know why we're striking. Sorry, we're not here to strike. We're here to mine gold. Let's go back to work. And the entire shaft emptied out, the whole hostel emptied out in good order. They went to the shaft, they got hoisted, and normal production continued. 5 shaft was one of the only shafts that continued working through the course of the 87 wage review strike. And this was in the teeth of the fact that the people were being necklaced elsewhere on the Wahlroos property for trying to bust that strike. Why? Because this Johan Botha, asked them to go back to work. So that for me indicates that the problem of communication is a 3-layered onion. The most peripheral thing is medium, because within that, there's a deeper problem, which is the thing that Volker spoke about. It is content. I mean, what are you saying? And the problem with this content is that it actually does have a moral kind of edge, because, is this true? And that actually invokes the primary problem, which is the issue of source credibility. Can I trust you? Because if I can trust you, I'll buy your content and I'll use your media. So from then on, I've always kind of understood that the gravitas of the leadership, the intent of the leadership actually is what buys the license to communicate. And if you don't have that gravitas, everything that you're going to be seen, everything you're going to put out, no matter how technically proficient it is from a communications point of view, will actually do you more harm than good, because they're going to actually, the better you are, the less they're going to trust you.
Yeah, I mean, it's I experience this as a bit of a damning critique of the typical narratives around communication, because they're not only focusing on what's superficial, but they if you spend too much time and kind of get too excited about how good you are with the superficial stuff, you can actually make the problem worse.
Exactly.
Because the key question actually with communication is really who is communicating.
Who's communicating? That's right.
And can I trust this person?
Exactly. And I only trust you when you've demonstrated you've acted in my own interest prior to this interaction.
Yeah, so I mean, don't worry about how well you're communicating. Go and earn trust. Go and act in people's interest as consistently as you can, and find opportunities to show the sincerity of your intent to people. the issue of communication will take care of itself.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I mean, isn't it interesting that very often in organizations, internal communications is also owned by the PR department? I mean, that says it all.
Yeah. Speaks with forked tongue, eh?
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
And I mean, we also saw this, we in the early days of our business, we were very involved with management, with employee reporting, actually, because the whole, your uncle Jerry Skaterman, he used to have this view, and I think it's still that's true. That if you want to treat people like they're kind of part of this business and not just as employees in the business, you better start talking to them about the performance of the business. It's kind of like a no-brainer, and I think that is right. But what I found intriguing is that the people that would readily jump at that message were people where organizations were struggling with a volatile workforce. And there was an element to this of them actually wanting to talk themselves out of a spot. If the organization was making money hands over fist and you suggested that they should start speaking to their employees that they were making money, they say, out of your mind. They don't want some of the goodies we're making here. So that for me just underscores the really conditional nature and the cynicism whereby leadership very often deals with their own people. We'll speak when it's in our interest to speak. We'll speak when I need to sort of somehow convince you that we're in trouble and we can't afford for you to strike.
I mean, there's an intent to manage the appearances of things in this whole debate, which then, and I like what you said. I mean, you only kind of give 3 rules for communication. I mean, we say that, okay, well, communication isn't the core issue. It's the intent underneath it. That's the core issue. But if we want to give rules of communication, then rule number 1 is it's based in listening prior to communicating. Number 2, it should be honest. And number 3, stay courteous, right?
That's right.
I mean, but this managing of appearances kind of intent that sits behind this kind of fascination with communication really undermines the first rule when it actually comes to communicating, which is stay honest.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, in fact, even because the managing of, because clearly when I'm trying to manage, what I'm trying to manage is my image. I'm trying to manage how you see me. You understand? I'm not. In other words, I'm the significant one here. So it's also actually contradicting the first requirement. It's not about me seeing you, which is when I listen. I'm suspending my agenda for you. It's about wanting you to see me. Absolutely. Wanting to be seen.
That's true.
And this element of wanting to be seen is really, it's a very despicable kind of, I mean, we all have it because we're human, but it's actually a very despicable quality. And it accounts for the inverse of it, accounts for why leaders who are humble are so effective and beget such loyalty. Because they fundamentally know, listen, the role of the self isn't the one to be seen. The role of the self is the one who's doing the seeing.
No, fantastic. Thank you for...
Thank you very much.
I will find more topics to talk about, but amazing insights, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All the best, Hassan.
All the best.